Copper Sun by Sharon Draper, Chapter 30, Tidbits Farewell. Polly shook herself awake as she heard voices outside the smokehouse. Sunlight filtered through the slats of the wooden structure. Isabel will recover quickly from the trauma of having a stillborn baby, she heard Mr. Derby say. Already she speaks of us having another child. The doctor's voice sounded unconvinced. Yes, of course. Make sure she gets plenty of rest. I intend to keep a close eye on her, Mr. Derby replied, his voice laced with barbs. Polly poked Mari, who was still asleep on Teeny's shoulder. Startled, Mari looked around in fear. Teeny, who perhaps had not slept at all, was whispering to Tidbit. Remember all them stories I told you about my mother and the Shanti and the monkey and the spider stories? She asked the boy, desperation in her voice. Yes'm, the boy replied, sounding as if he wasn't sure why his mother was telling him all this now. You remember the drums that talked like thunder and the sun that shone like copper over the valley? You remember what I told you about my mama and how she grabbed a piece of her own mother to take with her? Polly heard Teeny saying, Yes, Mama, I remembers, Tidbit said, a whispering dread in his voice. You takes this piece of cloth, you hear me, boy? Keep it safe, 'cause all my memories be tucked in it. You promise me you will never forget? She asked him plaintively as she hugged him close to her. Polly watched her tie a leather string around the boy's neck. A tiny leather pouch hung from it. Teeny tucked a colored piece of fabric into the packet and closed it tightly with a drawstring. I remembers it all, Mama, Tidbit said, his voice sounding truly frightened now. You're going to grow to be a man, a free man. I don't want to be no man, Tidbit protested. I just want to be your little boy. You're going to always be my baby boy, Teeny said, though her voice was thick with grief. Always. Polly thought back painfully to the night her mother died, how she had whispered to Polly with her last bit of strength, You make yourself a lady. You hear, my darling? I will always be with you. Polly knew that Teeny's heart felt as if it were being slashed into pieces. You going with us, Mama? The boy asked. I'll be along directly, Teeny lied. You stay close to Mina and Polly till I gets there, you hear? The boy agreed quietly, but he seemed to sense that something was wrong because he started crying. You mind them and do what they says, you hear? Yes'm, Tidbit replied in a small voice. They all heard the lock removed, and the bright sun shone in like a harsh surprise after the darkness of the smokehouse all night. Mr. Derby stood outside the door and called to them. Come on out there now. You have a long journey ahead of you, and Teeny, I expect to have breakfast on the table in half an hour. Yes, sir, she replied sullenly as she emerged from the small room. Teeny squeezed Tidbit's small hand tightly into hers. Amari and Polly came out next, blinking in the bright sunlight. When Amali reached for Polly's hand, Polly took it. The wagon stood hitched and ready. Dr. Haskins sat on the seat, looking straight ahead, not at the hapless group standing near the wagon. Clay was nowhere to be seen. My son is ill, Mr. Derby said to the doctor, so I'll entrust you to the transactions for the sale of these three. The doctor nodded silently. Polly and Amari exchanged looks. Evidently, Teeny's seeds had been effective. Would you like me to check young Clay before I leave? Dr. Hoskins asked half-heartedly. No, I believe he simply drank too much wine. He will sleep it off. Dr. Hoskins looked relieved. I will make sure your money for the sale of these three is safely delivered to you by a courier from Charlestown. He will return with your wagon. It's good riddance to a lot of them, Mr. Derby replied, a look of disgust on his face. To the frightened group in front of him, he yelled, Get in the wagon and be quick about it. Polly climbed in first. Yes, sir, she whispered. It was the same wagon that she and Amari had arrived in. Amari climbed in behind her. Mina, take this child, Mr. Derby commanded. He grabbed Tidbit from Teeny and slung the boy into the wagon behind Amari. Teeny exploded in grief. Don't take my baby. He my onlyest child. Oh, Lord, please don't take my baby from me. Teeny, seeing her mother so upset, Tidbit, seeing his mother so upset, began to wail, reaching for her and trying to squirm out of Amari's arms. Hush Puppy barked frantically, adding to the uproar. Mr. Derby, his face red, slashed at the dogs with his whip and ran yelping toward the rice fields. Mr. Derby then stung Teeny with the whip as well. Get to your kitchen and to your duties. You have no more business here. He pushed her in the direction of the kitchen, but she continued to scream and protest, inconsolable. Polly huddled in the wagon, wishing she knew a way to vent the anger that she needed to expel, but she was as helpless as the others. I believe it best if I leave quickly, Dr. Hoskins said over the noise. I agree, Mr. Derby replied. He smacked the horse on the rump. It whinnied, then began to amble on its way. The doctor redirected the wagon toward the road. Tidbit shrieked as he realized that he was really being taken away from his mother. Teeny fell to the ground, yelling her grief to the sky. Mr. Derby whipped her again and pulled her to her feet. He half dragged, half walked her back to the kitchen. Hush Puppy continued to bark frantically in the distance. Mama, Tidbit screamed hysterically. Mama! They turned past a bend in the road, and although she could still hear Teeny's anguished cries, Polly could see her no more. Amari held Tidbit, trying to soothe him, but Polly knew that nothing she could say or do would make the child feel better.